Good evening, and welcome to Truth Report. I'm Alex Truth.
And I'm Maya Clarity. Tonight, we're cutting through the headlines to expose what the mainstream media won't tell you about the global arms race accelerating right now, the economic warfare reshaping supply chains, and a so-called peace process being overseen by a war crime suspect. These stories are connected, and by the end of tonight's show, you'll see exactly how.
We're looking at 5 stories that reveal a dangerous pattern. China studying Ukraine's improvised drone warfare. Beijing pivoting from exports to overseas manufacturing to dodge tariffs. Singapore dropping $2.3 billion on American submarine hunters. And Netanyahu, literally wanted for war crimes, sitting on Trump's Gaza peace board while Israeli gunships continue firing under an active ceasefire.
The pattern? Military technology proliferation, economic nationalism disguised as globalization, and the complete collapse of accountability in international law. Let's start with what should terrify anyone paying attention to modern warfare.
According to reporting from the South China Morning Post, Kai Yi, the chief scientist at China North Industries Group Corporation, Netanyahu, one of the world's largest weapons manufacturers, has gone on record praising Ukraine's battlefield innovations with microdrones. And when I say innovations, I mean soldiers duct-taping hand grenades to consumer drones.
Let's be precise about what we're discussing here. Kai Yi established a classification system. Small bombs are 10 to 100 kilograms. Micro bombs are anything under 10 kilograms. Ukraine has been converting RKG 1600 anti-tank grenades, RGD-5 grenades with badminton shuttlecock fins for stability, even beer bottles filled with fuel into effective aerial munitions dropped from commercial quadcopters.
Badminton shuttlecocks. Beer bottles. Water bottles and duct tape. This is what modern asymmetric warfare looks like, and China's top weapons scientist is calling it, quote, a valuable example for observing drone warfare, and advocating that China develop modular bomb series and modification kits so soldiers can convert standard ammunition into aerial weapons right there on the battlefield.
Here's why this matters beyond the immediate horror. Netanyahu isn't some startup. According to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute's 2024 data, this company ranks 11th globally among defense contractors by revenue. They're a primary supplier to the People's Liberation Army. When their chief scientist goes on record endorsing improvised drone warfare techniques, that's a policy signal.
And the signal is this: the era of expensive, precision-guided munitions monopolized by wealthy militaries is over. We're entering a phase where a $200 consumer drone carrying a modified grenade can disable a $5 million tank. The barriers to entry for effective military force have collapsed.
Think about the implications. Every regional conflict, every separatist movement, every non-state actor now has access to airstrike capability. The technology can't be contained because it's built from components already in global commerce. DJI drones. GoPro cameras. Off-the-shelf electronics. Ukraine didn't invent this, they just demonstrated its effectiveness at scale against a conventional military.
And now China, a country that exports more commercial drones than anyone else on Earth, is systematically studying how to weaponize that commercial infrastructure. Kai Yi specifically mentioned developing modification kits. That means standardized, mass-producible conversion systems. We're talking about weaponization as a plug-and-play ecosystem.
Let's connect this to our second story, because there's a through line here about how China is repositioning itself in the global system. The South China Morning Post reports that Beijing is fundamentally rethinking its export-led growth model, and it's not because they've suddenly embraced fair trade.
China posted a record trade surplus of $1.19 trillion in 2025. Exports jumped 5.5%. That's an unprecedented imbalance, and it's generating massive friction with trading partners. French President Emmanuel Macron is publicly calling on Beijing to boost domestic consumption. The European Union is threatening tariffs. The United States already has tariffs in place.
So what's China's response? According to the Ministry of Commerce, they're going to, quote, guide the reasonable and orderly cross-border layout of industrial and supply chains and promote integrated development of trade and investment. That's bureaucratic language for we're moving our factories overseas to get around your tariffs.
Alfredo Monteforhello from Ancura Consulting put it clearly: the old export-led growth model faces diminishing returns in a protectionist global environment. China isn't retreating. They're adapting. Instead of shipping finished goods from Shenzhen and triggering tariffs, they'll manufacture in Mexico, Vietnam, Eastern Europe, and ship from there.
This is economic warfare by other means. David Zhang from Trivium China observed that Beijing's approach is becoming less about maximizing outward flows and more about selectivity, backing overseas expansion where it helps sustain market access and supply chain resilience. Translation: they're fortifying supply chains against sanctions and tariffs by embedding manufacturing capacity inside target markets.
And look at the numbers. Outbound direct investment from China grew only 1.3% to $145.66 billion in 2024. That's way down from the double-digit growth we saw in 2023 and 2024. But that's not retreat, that's consolidation. Chinese companies are being more strategic about where they invest, focusing on locations that provide tariff evasion and sustained market access.
Here's what that means practically. When you buy a product labeled Made in Vietnam or Made in Mexico, there's an increasing probability that it's manufactured by a Chinese-owned company using Chinese intermediate goods and Chinese management, just assembled by local labor. The supply chain hasn't diversified. It's just been geographically obfuscated.
And this connects directly back to the drone warfare story. If China establishes manufacturing hubs globally, they're also establishing the infrastructure to produce and distribute dual-use technologies. A factory making commercial drones can pivot to military applications. A plant producing electronics components can supply both civilian and military systems.
The barriers between commercial and military technology have dissolved, and China is building a global manufacturing network that can serve both purposes while dodging tariffs and sanctions. That's the strategic picture. Now let's look at how the United States is responding in its own sphere of influence.
The Defense Security Cooperation Agency announced approval of a $2.3 billion military sale to Singapore. For Boeing P-8A Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft, advanced torpedoes, sensor suites, the whole package. These aren't just reconnaissance planes. The P-8A is an anti-submarine warfare platform derived from the Boeing 737 commercial airliner.
Singapore is acquiring these to replace aging Fokker 50 aircraft, and they're expected to enter service in the early 2030s. Defense Minister Chan Chun-sing finalized the decision during talks at the Pentagon with Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth. The DSCA's justification was that this sale would improve Singapore's capability to meet current and future threats by providing a credible maritime force capable of deterring adversaries.
Deterring which adversaries? Let's not be coy. This is about China. Singapore sits at one of the most strategically critical choke points on Earth, the Strait of Malacca, through which roughly one-third of global maritime trade passes. Whoever controls the Malacca Strait controls access between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea.
And the P-8A Poseidon is specifically designed for anti-submarine warfare. That's relevant because China has been rapidly expanding its submarine fleet as part of its anti-access/area denial strategy. The People's Liberation Army Navy now operates more than 70 submarines, including nuclear-powered attack submarines and ballistic missile submarines.
So the United States is arming Singapore with submarine hunters, enhancing what the DSCA called training interoperability with allied nations including the US, UK, and Australia. That's the AUKUS partnership right there. This isn't just a bilateral deal. It's infrastructure for a multilateral military alliance explicitly aimed at containing Chinese naval power in the Indo-Pacific.
And Singapore is the perfect partner for this because of its geographic position and its political balancing act. Singapore maintains extensive trade relationships with China, it's their largest trading partner, but militarily they're integrated with the United States. They host U.S. naval vessels. They conduct joint exercises. They're buying American weapons systems.
This is the arms race in real time. China builds submarines to project power and deny access to the South China Sea. The United States responds by equipping regional partners with anti-submarine warfare platforms. Singapore gets advanced military capability. Boeing gets a $2.3 billion contract. And the whole region gets more militarized.
What's remarkable is how this is framed as defensive and stabilizing. The DSCA stated this enhances U.S. foreign policy objectives by bolstering a strategic partner that is an important force for political stability and economic progress in Asia. Stability through advanced torpedoes. Progress through submarine detection systems.
Meanwhile, every arms sale generates demand for countermeasures. China will develop quieter submarines, better torpedoes, enhanced naval capabilities. That drives more American sales to regional partners. The cycle is self-perpetuating and enormously profitable for defense contractors on both sides.
And congressional ratification for this sale is still pending, but it's essentially a formality. These deals don't get announced unless they're going through. The military-industrial complex is bipartisan. Now let's turn to our final story, which reveals just how completely international accountability has collapsed.
Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, is wanted for war crimes by the International Criminal Court. The ICC issued an arrest warrant based on allegations of crimes committed during Israel's military campaign in Gaza. And according to Al Jazeera's reporting today, Netanyahu has accepted a position on President Trump's Board of Peace for Gaza.
Let's absorb that. A man formerly accused of war crimes by the international legal system tasked with adjudicating such crimes is now positioned as a peacebroker for the very conflict in which those alleged crimes occurred. It's not irony. It's impunity.
And this is happening while Israeli forces continue military operations under an active ceasefire. Al Jazeera reports that an Israeli helicopter gunship opened fire on Palestinians in Deir el-Balah in central Gaza. Artillery attacks struck multiple areas in northern and southern Gaza. Israeli forces demolished residential buildings in Beit Lahia in the northern demarcation zone.
Since the ceasefire began in October 2025, at least 483 Palestinians have died according to Gaza's health ministry. That includes 169 children and 64 women. These aren't combatants caught in crossfire. These are casualties accumulating under a ceasefire supposedly monitored by a peace board that includes the leader of the military conducting the operations.
The scale of destruction in Gaza is almost incomprehensible. Nearly 80% of the territory's buildings have sustained damage or complete destruction. The infrastructure for civilian life, hospitals, schools, water systems, housing, has been systematically dismantled. And the architect of that campaign is now a peace broker.
UK lawyers and rights organizations have filed requests for targeted sanctions against Netanyahu, calling for financial and travel restrictions. But the United States, which holds veto power in the UN Security Council and largely funds Israel's military through annual aid packages exceeding $3 billion, is instead elevating him to a diplomatic role.
This reveals the fundamental truth about international law. It applies selectively based on power. The ICC can issue arrest warrants. European lawyers can file sanctions requests. None of it matters if the United States provides political and military cover. The rules-based international order only functions when convenient for hegemonic powers.
And Gaza has become a laboratory for military tactics that will proliferate globally, just like Ukraine has for drone warfare. Israel has been testing AI targeting systems, autonomous weapons platforms, advanced surveillance infrastructure. That technology will be exported, studied, and replicated.
So let's connect all of this, because these stories aren't separate. They're symptoms of the same systemic dynamic. China studies Ukraine's improvised drone warfare and plans to industrialize it. That's technology proliferation driven by conflict observation. China restructures its economy to embed manufacturing globally, making supply chains harder to sanction. That's economic warfare adaptation.
The United States arms Singapore with submarine hunters to contain Chinese naval power. That's alliance construction through militarization. And Netanyahu, accused of war crimes, sits on a peace board while operations continue under ceasefire. That's the complete breakdown of legal accountability when power politics override international law.
The pattern is this: we're watching the architecture of the post-World War II international system collapse in real time. The institutions built to prevent great power conflict, the UN, the ICC, the norms around territorial sovereignty and civilian protection, are failing because they were always dependent on the willingness of powerful states to accept constraints.
And that willingness has evaporated. The United States ignores international law when it suits its allies. China dodges trade rules by moving factories. Regional powers arm themselves because collective security has broken down. Non-state actors gain access to lethal technology because the barriers have dissolved.
What we're entering is a period of diffuse, persistent, multi-domain conflict. Not World War III in the traditional sense of massed armies and declared wars, but overlapping economic warfare, proxy conflicts, arms races, cyber operations, and information campaigns all happening simultaneously without clear beginnings or endings.
And the technologies emerging from these conflicts, drones with improvised munitions, AI targeting systems, autonomous weapons, are getting cheaper and more accessible. The monopoly on violence that states held is eroding. That's destabilizing in ways we're only beginning to understand.
The Yemen conflict showed us that non-state actors could threaten global shipping with relatively cheap drones and missiles. Ukraine showed us that consumer technology could be weaponized against conventional militaries. Gaza is showing us what AI-assisted targeting and total siege look like. These are case studies for future conflicts.
And China, the United States, and regional powers are all learning from these laboratories, adapting their strategies, positioning for advantage. The Singapore arms deal isn't about defending against an imminent invasion. It's about establishing capabilities for a long-term strategic competition in which control of maritime choke points determines who wins.
Meanwhile, civilian populations in conflict zones are bearing the cost. 483 dead in Gaza under ceasefire. Thousands more in Ukraine's grinding attritional war. Millions displaced. Entire cities reduced to rubble. And the international mechanisms meant to protect civilians or hold perpetrators accountable are non-functional.
Because the people who would be held accountable are the ones with the power to ignore or dismantle those mechanisms. Netanyahu won't be arrested as long as the United States shields him. Chinese companies won't be sanctioned effectively if they've embedded themselves in global supply chains. The arms dealers won't stop selling because conflict is their business model.
So what do we do with this information? First, recognize that the mainstream narrative about a rules-based international order is propaganda. The rules apply selectively. The order is maintained through coercion and economic leverage, not consent or legitimacy.
Second, understand that the technologies and tactics emerging from current conflicts will shape the next decade. Drone warfare, AI targeting, supply chain weaponization, these aren't future threats. They're present realities that will proliferate. Communities need to understand these risks and demand accountability from governments spending billions on arms and surveillance.
Third, resist the militarization narrative. Every arms sale is justified as defensive and stabilizing. Every military operation is framed as necessary and proportionate. That framing is designed to manufacture consent for policies that enrich defense contractors and entrench power structures while making populations less secure.
The $2.3 billion Singapore is spending on submarine hunters is $2.3 billion not spent on climate adaptation, public health, education, or infrastructure. Those are choices. The opportunity cost of militarization is a less secure, less prosperous, less stable world, even if Boeing's shareholders benefit.
And finally, demand that media coverage connect the dots. When outlets report on arms deals without mentioning the arms race. When they cover trade policy without explaining economic warfare. When they describe peace processes without noting that war crime suspects are sitting at the table. That's not journalism. That's stenography for power.
Our job, and the job of anyone trying to understand this historical moment, is to see the systems and patterns underneath the individual headlines. China isn't just studying drones. It's positioning for a multipolar world where technology proliferation and supply chain control matter more than traditional military alliances.
The United States isn't just selling weapons. It's constructing a network of dependencies and capabilities to contain China's rise. And the failures of accountability in Gaza aren't unique. They're indicative of a broader collapse of constraints on state violence when great powers decide international law doesn't serve their interests.
These dynamics are accelerating. The conflicts are multiplying. The technologies are spreading. And the institutions meant to manage all of this are broken. That's not pessimism. That's observation. The question is whether populations will recognize what's happening and demand different choices from their governments.
Because the current trajectory leads to more conflict, more militarization, more civilian casualties, and more resources diverted from human needs to instruments of violence. That's not inevitable. It's a choice. But it's a choice that requires people to see through the propaganda and understand the stakes.
We're not going to get that understanding from mainstream outlets that depend on access to government sources and advertising from defense contractors. We're not going to get it from politicians who take campaign donations from arms manufacturers. It has to come from independent journalism and an informed public willing to ask hard questions.
So when you see headlines about drone warfare innovations or arms deals or peace processes, ask who benefits. Ask what's not being said. Ask what the opportunity costs are. Ask whether the framing serves public understanding or elite interests. Those questions are the beginning of accountability.
That's what we're here for. To ask those questions. To expose the patterns. To connect the stories that power would prefer remain separate. Because the truth is simple, we're in the middle of a global transformation driven by technological change, economic competition, and the breakdown of post-war institutions. How that transformation unfolds depends on whether people understand it's happening.
From all of us at Truth Report, stay informed, stay critical, and demand better from the systems that claim to serve you.
Good night.